Imagine waking up tomorrow to a world where the sun rises pale and cold, barely warming the frozen ground beneath your feet, where ice sheets tower miles high across entire continents, gleaming blue-white under ash-darkened skies, where the ocean has retreated so far from its former shores that you could walk from Asia to Australia on dry land, where forests have become tundra, grasslands have turned to desert, and the few scattered bands of humans left alive huddle around fires, wondering if they'll see another spring. Now imagine that world isn't tomorrow, it's 74,000 years ago, and you're there. There are fewer humans alive on the entire planet than attend a typical college football game today. Maybe 3,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals scattered across Africa and parts of Asia. That's it. The whole of humanity, clinging to existence by fingernails in a world that seems determined to kill them. Today we don't think about how fragile we once were. There are over 8 billion of us now. We've conquered every environment on Earth, from the Arctic to the Sahara. We've split atoms, mapped our own DNA, and landed robots on Mars. We act like we're invincible, like we've always been the dominant species on this planet. But 74,000 years ago, we were prey. We were vulnerable. We were dying. And here's the thing that should keep you awake tonight, except I'm literally making this to help you sleep, so it probably won't. Most people have never heard this story. It's not taught in schools. It's barely mentioned in documentaries. The closest brush with extinction our species ever faced. And it's like this secret written in our DNA that nobody talks about. Scientists didn't even confirm it happened until the early 2000s. Before that, it was just a theory, a mathematical possibility hidden in genetic data. But when researchers finally pieced together the evidence from genetics, archaeology, climate science, and geology, the picture that emerged was terrifying. Our ancestors came within a few thousand individuals of total extinction. One more disaster, one more bad winter, one unlucky epidemic, and there would be no humans, no cities, no art, no music, no history. Just another extinct species that almost made it. Tonight, we're going back to that frozen world, to the last great Ice Age winter when humanity faced its darkest hour and somehow, impossibly, survived. We're going to walk through miles of ice, past the bones of species that didn't make it, into caves where small groups of humans painted on walls by firelight and told stories to keep hope alive. We're going to meet the other human species who shared that frozen world with us, most of whom didn't survive. And we're going to discover how the very thing that nearly killed us might have made us who we are today. This isn't just ancient history. This is your history, my history, the story of how we're all here against odds so astronomical that the fact you're reading this right now is basically a miracle wrapped in about 3,000 generations of stubborn refusal to die. Before we dive deep into the ice, do me a favour. Leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Every time I read these comments, it blows my mind. Tokyo at dawn, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all of us descendants of those few thousand survivors spread across the whole planet now, connected by technology our ancestors couldn't have imagined sharing this story about when we almost weren't. Okay, get comfortable, turn down the lights, let your breathing slow, because this is a long story. The way all good stories about deep time should be. We're going to move slowly through the frozen millennia, letting the ice and ash and darkness of that ancient world wash over us. No rush, no hurry. Just a gentle journey back through 74,000 years to a world most people never knew existed. The thing about the Ice Age is that it wasn't just one thing. It was layers upon layers of crisis, stretching across tens of thousands of years. But there was one moment, one catastrophic event that nearly ended everything. An explosion so massive it makes modern volcanic eruptions look like birthday candles. An event that plunged the world into volcanic winter and pushed humanity to the absolute brink. That event was called Toba. And before we can understand what happened to our ancestors during the long freeze that followed, We need to understand what the world looked like before the mountain exploded and turned the sky to ash. We need to go back even further, back to when there were more of us, when the climate was warmer, when our ancestors had no idea that the world as they knew it was about to end. Let's start 100,000 years ago in a world that's about to be destroyed. Close your eyes and imagine a world that seems impossible. A world where hippos swam in the Thames River where London now stands, where forests stretched across what would become the Sahara Desert, thick and green and full of life, where sea levels were actually higher than today, lapping at coastlines that would later emerge as fertile plains. This was Earth 100,000 years ago, during what scientists call the Eemian interglacial period. And it was warmer than the world you're living in right now. The average global temperature was about 2 degrees Celsius higher than today. That might not sound like much, but it was enough to transform the planet. The Arctic was mostly ice-free in summer. Greenland's ice sheet had melted back to maybe half its current size. Sea levels were 6 to 9 meters higher than they are today. Entire regions that would later become critical to human civilization were underwater, waiting for the ice to return and lock up enough ocean water to expose them. But here's what matters for our story. In this warm, lush world, humans existed. Not just any humans, but your direct ancestors. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens who had emerged in Africa somewhere between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago. By 100,000 years ago, they had been around long enough to develop sophisticated technologies, complex social structures, and the beginnings of symbolic thinking. But they were also confined, trapped almost entirely within the African continent, one species among many competing for survival. And they were rare. Genetic analysis suggests that around this time, the entire human population across Africa might have numbered somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 individuals. That's it. For an entire species spread across the world's second largest continent, that's an incredibly thin thread of existence. For comparison, today there are more people living in a single city block in Manhattan than there were humans on Earth 100,000 years ago. They lived in small bands, maybe 30 to 50 people travelling together, connected by kinship networks that stretched across hundreds of miles. These weren't primitive savages barely scraping by. They were sophisticated hunter-gatherers who had mastered their environments. They made compound tools, spears with carefully shaped stone points, hafted to wooden shafts with plant resins. They knew how to read landscapes, tracking animal migrations across seasons, finding water sources in dry periods, identifying which plants were food and which were medicine. Some groups were already creating art. Not the elaborate cave paintings that would come tens of thousands of years later, but the beginnings. Ochre pigments ground into powder and mixed with fat, shell beads strung on plant fibres, carved bone fragments marked with abstract patterns that might have been early attempts at record-keeping or might have been purely decorative. Nobody knows for sure. But they show something crucial. These people were thinking symbolically, using objects to represent ideas, creating culture. Their social structures were probably more complex than we often imagine. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherers suggest our ancestors lived in what researchers call fission-fusion societies. Large networks of related individuals who had come together in times of abundance, splitting into smaller groups when resources became scarce. They maintained these connections through elaborate gift exchange systems, through storytelling, through careful management of kinship obligations. Survival didn't just mean finding food, it meant maintaining the social bonds that would help you survive the next drought, the next shortage, the next crisis. But here's the thing, they weren't alone. The planet 100,000 years ago was home to multiple human species, each carved by evolution to fit different environments, each with their own survival strategies and cultural innovations. This wasn't a world dominated by one type of human. This was a world where humanity came in multiple forms, and the competition between them was just beginning to heat up. In Europe and Western Asia, the Neanderthals reigned supreme. They had been there for perhaps 400,000 years, perfectly adapted to the cold climates and seasonal extremes of Ice Age Europe. Robust, powerful, with brains actually larger than those of modern humans. They hunted massive Ice Age mammals, lived in social groups, cared for their sick and injured, and buried their dead with what looks like ritual attention. They weren't the brutish cavemen of popular imagination. They were formidable survivors who had mastered one of the harshest environments on Earth. In Asia, the Denisovans were thriving, though we know less about them. We only discovered they existed in 2010, when geneticists analysed a finger bone from a Siberian cave and realised it belonged to a human species nobody had ever identified before. Since then, genetic analysis has revealed they were widespread, from the Altai Mountains to Southeast Asia, possibly even reaching the Philippines. Some had adapted to high altitudes, developing genetic variants that helped them breathe thin air. Others might have been skilled seafarers, island hopping across Southeast Asia. They were innovators, survivors, just as successful in Asia as Neanderthals were in Europe. And there were others. Homo erectus was still hanging on in Indonesia, the last remnants of a species that had once spread across the old world. Small-bodied humans, possibly Homo floresiensis, lived on isolated islands, having evolved into something unique and strange. There might have been other species we haven't discovered yet, populations whose fossil remains are waiting to be found, or have been destroyed by time and geology. All of these humans shared a warming world, a planet that seemed to be settling into a comfortable equilibrium. But nothing in Earth's climate ever settles permanently. The same orbital mechanics that had ushered in the Eemian warmth were already shifting. Earth's relationship with the Sun depends on 3 cycles. The shape of our orbit around the Sun changes from nearly circular to more elliptical over about 100,000 years. The tilt of Earth's axis shifts between 22.1 and 24.5 degrees over 41,000 years, and the axis itself wobbles like a spinning top over about 26,000 years. These cycles don't change the total amount of sunlight hitting Earth, but they change how that sunlight is distributed. And in the complex feedback systems of Earth's climate, distribution matters more than total amount. Around 115,000 years ago, these cycles began shifting in ways that reduced summer sunlight in the northern hemisphere. This meant less ice melting in summer, more accumulation in winter. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the great ice sheets that had retreated during the Eemian began to grow again. The forests of northern Europe started retreating south. The monsoons that watered Africa began weakening. Sea levels started dropping as water locked up in growing glaciers. The warm, abundant world was beginning to close. But this was a gradual process, playing out over thousands of years. The humans living through these changes probably didn't notice the trend. They just knew that some years were colder than others, some decades saw more droughts, some generations struggled more than their grandparents had. Your ancestors in Africa were experiencing this shift differently than the Neanderthals in Europe or the Denisovans in Asia. Africa doesn't have massive ice sheets to track climate change, but it has something just as telling: rainfall patterns. And those patterns were becoming less reliable. The forests were beginning to fragment. The savanna grasslands that had supported large animal populations were starting to shrink. Water sources that had been permanent for generations were becoming seasonal, then disappearing entirely. This was creating pressure. Not catastrophic pressure, not yet, but the kind of grinding stress that forces populations to make choices. Some groups probably moved, following the retreating forests or the shifting grasslands. Others stayed put, adapting to the changing conditions, learning to exploit new resources as old ones vanished. The population networks that had maintained human survival were being tested. Some groups thrived, others struggled. Some probably went extinct, their genetic lineages ending as drought or disease or simple bad luck caught up with them. But this was normal. This was the rhythm of human existence during the Pleistocene, the Ice Age epoch that had defined human evolution for nearly 2 million years. Climate shifted, populations adapted or moved or died, and life went on. The humans of 100,000 years ago had ancestors who had survived dozens of these climate cycles. They had the knowledge, the technology, the social structures to adapt. They were survivors. They would endure. What they couldn't know, what nobody could have known, was that the gradual cooling was just the warm-up, thousands of miles to the east, beneath what would one day be the Indonesian island of Sumatra, deep in Earth's mantle, something was stirring. Magma was accumulating in a chamber so vast that the human mind can barely comprehend its scale. Pressure was building, rock was melting, gases were dissolving into superheated liquid, waiting for release. The Toba volcanic system had been quiet for hundreds of thousands of years, but it was waking up. And when it finally erupted, it would do so with a violence that would make every volcanic eruption in recorded human history look like a firecracker. It would inject so much material into the atmosphere that it would block out the sun across entire continents. It would trigger a volcanic winter that would last for years, maybe decades. It would push an already cooling world over the edge into something approaching a mini ice age. And it would nearly destroy humanity, nearly end the entire human experiment before it had really begun. Your ancestors, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, all the other human species scattered across the planet, they were all about to face the greatest survival challenge in human history. Most of them wouldn't make it. Most of the genetic lineages, most of the populations, most of the cultural knowledge accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years, all of it would be lost in what came next. But a few would survive. A few thousand individuals, maybe fewer, would find a way to endure. And those survivors would carry in their genes the potential for everything that came after. Every city ever built, every work of art ever created, every scientific discovery ever made, all of it was contingent on those few individuals surviving what was about to happen. The world was warm, life was abundant, multiple human species were thriving across 3 continents. Our ancestors were just one thread in a tapestry of human diversity, no more special, no more destined for greatness than the Neanderthals or Denisovans or any of the others. Then the world exploded. Now, let's talk about what might have triggered the worst phase of the crisis, what might have taken a world that was already struggling and pushed it right to the edge of habitability. 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra in what is now Indonesia, something had been building for thousands of years, something that would make every natural disaster in recorded human history look like a minor inconvenience. Deep beneath the island, a magma chamber had been filling. Not gradually, not slowly, but relentlessly. Molten rock from Earth's mantle was pushing upward, accumulating in a massive underground reservoir. The pressure was building. The rock above was stretching, cracking, trying to contain forces that would eventually prove unstoppable. For millennia, the warning signs would have been impossible to miss if anyone had been paying attention. Earthquakes rattling the region, hot springs appearing where none had existed before. The ground itself slowly bulging upward as the magma chamber swelled beneath. But the humans living in the region, if any were there at all, would have had no framework for understanding what was coming. No mythology, no cultural memory of volcanic eruptions on this scale, because nothing like this had happened in human history, nothing even close. Then one day, the rock gave way. The eruption of Mount Toba wasn't like the volcanoes you might have seen in documentaries or news footage. This wasn't Mount St. Helens blowing its top off in 1980, dramatic as that was. This wasn't even Krakatoa in 1883, which killed tens of thousands and was heard 3,000 miles away. Toba was something else entirely, something almost incomprehensible in scale. When the magma chamber finally breached the surface, it ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. Let me put that in perspective. Mount St. Helens, one of the most destructive eruptions in modern American history, ejected about 1 cubic kilometer of material. Krakatoa, which created tsunamis that killed 36,000 people and affected global climate, ejected maybe 25 cubic kilometers. Toba ejected 2,800. That's roughly 100 times more powerful than Krakatoa, about 3,000 times greater than Mount St. Helens, the largest volcanic eruption in the past 2 million years. The kind of event that happens maybe once in a geological age, and it happened right in the middle of humanity's already desperate struggle for survival. Picture what those first moments were like. The initial explosion would have been visible from hundreds of miles away. A column of superheated rock, ash and gas shooting upward at supersonic speeds, punching through the atmosphere, reaching heights of maybe 50 kilometers. That's higher than most passenger jets fly. Higher than weather happens. Into the stratosphere itself. The sound would have been beyond anything humans had ever experienced. Krakatoa was heard 3,000 miles away. Toba was vastly more powerful. People in India, 3,000 kilometers away, would have heard it. Maybe people as far as East Africa, 7,000 kilometers distant, might have heard something, a distant rumble that went on, shaking the ground beneath their feet. But the sound was just the beginning. Within hours, pyroclastic flows, avalanches of superheated gas and rock particles travelling at hundreds of kilometers per hour, were racing across Sumatra. Nothing survived in their path. Not trees, not animals, certainly not any humans who might have been living on the island. Within a day, much of Sumatra was buried under meters of volcanic debris. The tsunamis came next. When that much material erupts from an island, it creates displacement waves that radiate outward in all directions. Walls of water, possibly tens of meters high, crashed into coastlines across the Indian Ocean. Indonesia, India, East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, all would have been hit by massive waves arriving without warning. Any coastal human populations would have been devastated. The archaeological record from this period is sparse, but what we have suggests dramatic population crashes in many regions around the Indian Ocean rim. Some of that might have been the tsunamis. Much more was what came next. The ash started falling within days, first across Southeast Asia, a black blizzard that buried everything under layers of volcanic debris, then across India, where the ash accumulated to depth that still amaze geologists today. In some parts of India, you can dig down and find ash layers from Toba that are 6 meters thick. 6 meters. That's 20 feet of volcanic ash that fell from the sky 74,000 years ago. Imagine living through that. The sky turns black. Not night black, not storm black, but a dense, choking darkness filled with falling particles that burn your lungs when you breathe. The ash covers everything. Plants, water sources, animals. It gets into food, into shelter, into everything, and it keeps falling, day after day after day. Traces of Toba ash have been found across South Asia, in Malaysia, in the South China Sea, in the Arabian Sea. There's even evidence of Toba ash in East Africa, carried by upper atmosphere winds across thousands of kilometers. The eruption literally spread debris across a quarter of the planet's surface. But the ash was just the immediate crisis. The real catastrophe was what happened to the atmosphere. When a volcano erupts, it doesn't just eject rock and ash. It also releases massive amounts of sulfur dioxide gas. This gas rises into the stratosphere, where it reacts with water vapor to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. These droplets are incredibly reflective. They bounce sunlight back into space before it can reach Earth's surface. After major volcanic eruptions, global temperatures drop. After Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, ejecting maybe 10 cubic kilometers of material, global temperatures fell by about 0.5 degrees Celsius for a year or two. That was enough to cause crop failures and climate disruptions worldwide. Toba ejected 280 times more material than Pinatubo. The best estimates suggest that global temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius in the years following the eruption. In some regions, especially at higher latitudes, the cooling might have been even more severe. This is what scientists call a volcanic winter. The sun still rises, but its warmth can't penetrate the veil of sulfuric acid droplets circling the planet in the stratosphere. For years, maybe a decade or more, Earth's climate would have been dramatically colder than normal. And remember, this was already during an ice age. The world was already cold and dry. Toba made it colder and drier still. In regions that had been marginal for human habitation, conditions became impossible. In places that had been difficult, they became marginal. The buffer disappeared. The margin for error vanished. Survival became a matter of luck as much as skill. The cooling affected everything. Plant growth slowed or stopped entirely in many regions. The growing seasons in temperate zones became shorter, less reliable. Animals that humans depended on for food either died or migrated to regions where food was still available. Water sources dried up as precipitation patterns shifted. Archaeological sites from this period show a pattern that's hard to mistake. Populations crash. Sites that had been continuously occupied for thousands of years are suddenly abandoned. Stone tool traditions that had been passed down for generations disappear from the record. It's as if entire human groups just vanished. Some anthropologists call this the Toba catastrophe theory. The idea that the eruption caused such severe climate disruption that it nearly drove humanity extinct, creating the genetic bottleneck we talked about earlier. But here's where it gets complicated. Because not all scientists agree that Toba was as catastrophic as this theory suggests. The debate has been fierce in academic circles for decades. Some researchers point to the genetic evidence of a severe population bottleneck around 70,000 years ago, and the perfect timing with Toba. They argue that the correlation is too strong to be coincidental. The eruption happened, the climate crashed, humanity nearly went extinct. Others aren't so sure. They point to archaeological sites in India that show continuous occupation before, during, and after the Toba eruption. They note that some animal populations don't show the kind of dramatic crashes you'd expect from a true catastrophe. They argue that while Toba was certainly devastating, its effects might have been more regional than global. Recent research has started to paint a more nuanced picture. Yes, Toba was an enormous eruption. Yes, it certainly caused significant climate disruption. But the exact magnitude and duration of that disruption is still being debated. Some climate models suggest the volcanic winter might have lasted only a few years rather than a decade. Others propose that the cooling was severe, but that some regions were affected much more than others. Equatorial areas might have remained relatively stable, while higher latitudes suffered extreme conditions. There's also growing evidence that the genetic bottleneck might have begun before Toba erupted, that humanity was already in crisis when the volcano exploded, and Toba simply made a bad situation much worse. Not the sole cause of near extinction, but the final push that almost ended our species. The truth, as it often does, probably lies somewhere in the middle. Toba was undoubtedly one of the worst natural disasters in human history. The ash deposits don't lie. The scale of the eruption is not in question. Something that big had to have had enormous consequences. But whether it alone caused the genetic bottleneck, or whether it was one disaster among many during a period of general climate crisis, that's still being worked out. Science is a process, not a collection of final answers. Our understanding of Toba's impact continues to evolve as new evidence emerges. What we can say with confidence is this: 74,000 years ago, Earth experienced a volcanic eruption of almost unimaginable power. In the aftermath, human populations crashed dramatically. Whether from the eruption itself, from the climate disruptions it caused, or from the accumulated effects of ongoing ice age conditions, doesn't really matter to the humans who lived through it. What matters is that they survived. Somehow, despite the ash and the cold and the darkness, despite watching their world literally explode and then freeze, despite every reason to give up and let extinction take its course, they held on. Small groups scattered across Africa and maybe parts of Asia, living in caves, huddling around fires, eating whatever they could find, watching children die, watching the old and weak succumb to cold and hunger, but surviving, always surviving. The ash layers from Toba are still there, buried in the earth across South Asia, a physical reminder of the day the world exploded. But above those ash layers, in the archaeological record that continues upward through time, you still find evidence of human presence. Stone tools, fire pits, animal bones with cut marks, the signature of human persistence. We made it through. Not easily, not without terrible losses, but we made it. And the genes that carried us through that volcanic winter are still here, still functioning in every human alive today. Here's something that should keep you awake at night. Right now, as you're listening to this, there are more than 8 billion people on Earth. We're everywhere. Every continent except Antarctica has permanent human settlements. We've built cities, civilizations, technologies that would seem like magic to our ancestors. We've even left the planet, walked on the moon, sent machines to the edge of the solar system. But rewind 70,000 years, and the entire human population might have been small enough to fit inside a modern sports stadium. Maybe 3,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals, total, across the entire planet. Think about that for a second. Not 3 million, not 300,000, maybe 10,000 people. That's less than the population of a small town. That's fewer people than attend a single concert at Madison Square Garden. And from that impossibly small group, every human being who has ever lived since descended. You, me, every person you've ever met, every person you've ever heard of. All of us trace our ancestry back to a population that could have disappeared with one bad season, one disease outbreak, one catastrophic event. This is what scientists call a population bottleneck, and it's one of the most important events in human history, one that almost guaranteed we would never exist at all. So what exactly is a population bottleneck? Imagine you have a jar full of marbles, hundreds of them in dozens of different colours. Each colour represents a different genetic variant, a different version of the genes that make individuals unique. Now imagine you dump out all but 10 marbles, randomly. Just 10 marbles survive. When you start refilling the jar, breeding those 10 marbles back up to hundreds, the diversity's gone forever. You only have the colours that happen to survive that random selection event. Everything else, all those other genetic variants, they're extinct, lost, irretrievable. That's what happened to humanity. Sometime around 70,000 years ago, probably triggered by the Toba supervolcano eruption we talked about earlier, human populations crashed, hard, and when we finally recovered, we'd lost something we could never get back. Genetic diversity. The evidence for this bottleneck is written into every cell of your body. Scientists discovered it by accident, actually. In the 1980s and 90s, researchers studying human genetics started noticing something weird. When they compared human DNA to DNA from other great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, they kept finding the same strange pattern. Humans were too similar to each other. Look at chimpanzees. Take 2 chimps from the same forest in Africa, analyze their DNA, and you'll find they're more genetically different from each other than a human from Norway is from a human from Namibia, even though those humans are separated by thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years of separate evolutionary history. How is that possible? How can chimps living in the same forest be more diverse than humans spread across the entire planet? The answer is the bottleneck. At some point in our recent past, human genetic diversity was stripped down to almost nothing. The genetic variants that survived were just the ones that happened to be present in that tiny surviving population. Everything else vanished. The real breakthrough came when researchers started analysing mitochondrial DNA. Now mitochondria are the little power plants inside your cells that convert food into energy. They have their own separate DNA, and here's the key part: you inherit mitochondrial DNA, only from your mother. not from both parents, just your mother. Her mother gave it to her, her mother's mother gave it to her mother, unbroken chain going back through time. This makes mitochondrial DNA incredibly useful for tracing ancestry. Every time DNA copies itself, tiny random mutations accumulate. These mutations are like molecular clocks. The more mutations separate two people's mitochondrial DNA, the longer ago their maternal lineages diverged. Scientists can literally count the mutations and calculate how long ago two people shared a common maternal ancestor. When researchers did this analysis across human populations worldwide, they discovered something shocking. All human mitochondrial DNA traces back to a single woman who lived in Africa, somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. Scientists call her Mitochondrial Eve, though that's a bit misleading because she wasn't the only woman alive at the time. She's just the only woman from that era whose maternal lineage survived to the present day. Every other woman's line went extinct. Then scientists did the same analysis with Y chromosome DNA, which passes only from father to son, and they found the same pattern. All modern human Y chromosomes trace back to a single man, Y chromosomal Adam, who lived roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago in Africa. But here's where it gets really interesting. When you calculate the effective population size based on these genetic patterns, the amount of genetic diversity you'd expect to see given how much time has passed, the numbers come back impossibly small. To produce the level of genetic similarity we see in modern humans, our population must have gone through at least one, possibly several, extreme bottlenecks. The most severe bottleneck appears to have occurred around 70,000 years ago, right after Toba. Genetic models suggest the breeding population, the number of individuals actually reproducing and passing on genes, dropped to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people. Some estimates go even lower, as low as 1,000 breeding pairs. Let that sink in. 1,000 breeding pairs means maybe 2,000 to 3,000 total people if you include children and elderly individuals who weren't actively reproducing. That's a small village. That's a couple of apartment buildings. That's nothing. From a population genetics standpoint, this is catastrophic. When populations get this small, all sorts of terrible things start happening genetically. Random chance starts mattering more than natural selection. Harmful genetic mutations that would normally be eliminated by natural selection can spread just because there aren't enough people for selection to work efficiently. Inbreeding becomes unavoidable. Even distant relatives are reproducing together because there simply aren't enough unrelated individuals to go around. Population geneticists have a technical term for this: genetic drift. In small populations, genes can become more or less common just by random chance, completely independent of whether they're actually beneficial. It's like flipping a coin. Flip it 1,000,000 times and you'll get close to 50-50 heads and tails. But flip it 10 times, you might get 7 heads and 3 tails. Pure randomness. During the bottleneck, human evolution was being driven more by coin flips than by survival of the fittest. That should have been disastrous. Species that go through severe bottlenecks usually suffer from reduced fitness, accumulation of harmful mutations, decreased ability to adapt to changing environments. Many go extinct shortly after because they've lost the genetic tools they need to survive. But somehow, impossibly, humans not only survived the bottleneck but thrived afterward. Within 60,000 years, we'd spread across the entire planet, outlasted every other human species, and become the most successful large mammal in Earth's history. How? That's one of the great mysteries of human evolution, and scientists are still debating the answer. Some researchers argue the bottleneck wasn't actually as severe as the genetic data suggests. Maybe human populations were subdivided into small isolated groups that rarely interbreed. This structure could create a genetic signature that looks like a bottleneck, even if the total population was larger. Instead of 3,000 people total, maybe there were 30,000 people, divided into dozens of small bands that maintained genetic separation for thousands of years. This is the metapopulation hypothesis. Picture it like islands in an archipelago. Each island has its own small population, maybe 100 to 200 people. They're close enough that occasional migrants move between islands, preventing complete genetic isolation. But they're separate enough that most reproduction happens within islands, not between them. From a genetic standpoint, this looks similar to a true bottleneck. Reduced diversity, limited gene flow, strong effects of genetic drift. But the total population is much larger, and the extinction risk is much lower, because no single disaster can wipe out all the islands at once. Other scientists point out that the genetic data is consistent with not one bottleneck, but several. Maybe human populations have crashed and recovered multiple times over the past 200,000 years, each time stripping away more genetic diversity. The Toba eruption might have been the most recent and severe, but perhaps not the only crisis our ancestors endured. There's also the possibility that different human populations experience different bottlenecks at different times. Maybe African populations crashed 100,000 years ago due to one climate event, while populations in the Middle East crashed 70,000 years ago due to Toba. When researchers analyze global genetic patterns, they're seeing the combined signature of multiple regional disasters compressed into what looks like a single global bottleneck. But here's what's not controversial. Modern humans have strikingly low genetic diversity compared to other species. That's just a fact. Cheetahs are famous for having gone through a severe genetic bottleneck. They're so genetically uniform that skin grafts between unrelated cheetahs don't get rejected because their immune systems literally can't tell each other apart. But even cheetahs have more genetic diversity than humans do in some regions of the genome. We're all incredibly, remarkably, almost impossibly similar to each other genetically. Two humans chosen at random from anywhere on Earth will have DNA that's 99.9% identical. The 0.1% that varies accounts for all visible human diversity. Every difference in height, skin colour, facial features, disease susceptibility, athletic ability, everything that makes individuals unique is encoded in that tiny fraction of genetic difference. For comparison, two chimps from the same forest can differ by 0.3% to 0.4% of their DNA. They're 3 to 4 times more diverse than humans spread across continents. This is the fingerprint of the bottleneck, permanent, undeniable, written into every cell of every person who has ever lived. And this has consequences. Some good, some potentially very bad. On the positive side, low genetic diversity means humans are all fundamentally the same species. There are no subspecies of humans, no distinct races in any biological sense. The genetic differences between human populations are tiny, superficial, mostly just adaptations to local climates and diets. Beneath surface differences, we're all carrying essentially the same genes, all descendants of the same tiny group of bottleneck survivors. This genetic unity probably contributed to one of humanity's greatest strengths, our capacity for cooperation. Low genetic diversity means low relatedness diversity. Everyone is equally related to everyone else, more or less. This might have made it easier to develop social systems based on cooperation with non-relatives. Why help strangers? Because genetically, there are no strangers. We're all cousins. But low genetic diversity also creates vulnerabilities. When a disease appears that exploits a particular genetic susceptibility, it can spread through human populations like wildfire, because we're all susceptible. We don't have the genetic variation that would allow some individuals to be naturally resistant. The Black Death killed a third of Europe in the 14th century, partly because humans lacked genetic diversity in immune system genes. Modern humans also show evidence of having accumulated slightly deleterious genetic mutations during the bottleneck. Not immediately fatal, but harmful enough that they reduce fitness in subtle ways. These mutations should have been eliminated by natural selection, but in a tiny population experiencing strong genetic drift, they survived and spread. Every human genome carries dozens of these mildly harmful variants. Collectively, they probably reduce human fitness by a few percentage points compared to what it would be without the bottleneck. We're still paying the genetic price for nearly going extinct 70,000 years ago, but we're also still benefiting from whatever was selected for during those desperate millennia. The humans who survived the bottleneck weren't random. They were the ones tough enough, smart enough, cooperative enough to endure when 95% of humanity died. Whatever genetic variants they carried, whatever genes contributed to their survival, those are the genes we all inherited. Maybe that's why humans seem to thrive on adversity. Maybe that's why we're so good at innovating when everything goes wrong, at cooperating when cooperation is the only way to survive. Maybe our entire species was shaped, forged really, by the worst environmental disaster we ever faced. And maybe we carry the psychological and genetic legacy of that disaster with us still. Every person alive today is descended from survivors, from people who refused to give up when the world was ending, from ancestors who kept having children even when the future looked hopeless, from individuals who somehow maintained enough cooperation, enough knowledge sharing, enough sheer stubborn determination to keep humanity alive through the longest, darkest period in our species' history. You are not descended from the ones who gave up. You're descended from the ones who survived, and that legacy, that inheritance of survival against impossible odds, is written into every cell of your body. But survival was just the beginning. The question isn't just how we endured the bottleneck, it's how we endured everything that came after. Because when the volcanic winter finally ended, the Ice Age was just getting started. Close your eyes and imagine this. You wake up before dawn, but you can't tell because the sky has been the same ash-grey colour for as long as anyone can remember. Your grandmother told you stories about something called the sun, a bright light that made the sky blue and warmed your skin. But you've never seen it. Nobody alive has. That's just a story now, like the tales of animals, so numerous they covered the grasslands like flowing water. Today you're hungry. You've been hungry for 3 days. The hunting party went out yesterday and came back empty-handed. Again. The herds that used to pass through this valley have been gone for years, maybe decades. You're not sure anymore. Time becomes strange when every day looks exactly like the one before. The plants your mother taught you to gather, the roots and berries that used to sustain your group between hunts, they're withered and dying. The spring that gave your camp water has frozen solid. Someone will have to break through the ice again, and it's getting thicker every year. This is what survival looked like during the volcanic winter. Not a dramatic battle against nature, just a grinding, endless struggle against starvation and cold. A daily test of whether you were clever enough, tough enough, lucky enough to see another sunrise in a world that seemed designed to kill you. But here's the thing, you survived. Somehow, impossibly, your ancestors made it through. The question that has haunted anthropologists for decades is simple. How? How did humans, a species adapted for warm African climates, endure years of volcanic winter followed by millennia of climate instability? The answer lies in 3 things: geography, innovation, and the one survival skill that sets humans apart from almost every other species, our ability to cooperate even when everything is falling apart. Let's start with geography, because location was literally everything. When Toba erupted and the volcanic winter descended, not all places suffered equally. Some regions, through sheer geological luck, remained marginally more habitable than others. These places, called refugia, became humanity's lifeboats. Scientists have spent years trying to identify where these refugia might have been. The evidence points to a few key locations: coastal areas in East Africa, possibly the Cape region of South Africa, maybe the Great Rift Valley where geological activity created microclimates, and potentially a few scattered locations in Central Africa, where geography protected against the worst climate effects. The most compelling evidence comes from a place called Pinnacle Point in South Africa. This is a series of coastal caves overlooking the Indian Ocean, and the archaeological record there is absolutely remarkable. Continuous human occupation through the entire crisis period. Not just scattered evidence, consistent layer after layer of stone tools, food remains, and ash from cooking fires, showing that people lived in these caves generation after generation, while the world outside was dying. The researchers who excavated Pinnacle Point found something extraordinary. During the worst phases of the climate disaster, when inland sites show complete abandonment, these coastal caves show intensified occupation. More tools, more evidence of daily activity, more signs that this had become a critical refuge for human survival. Why? Because the coast offered something the interior couldn't: stability. The ocean is like a massive thermal battery. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, buffering coastal areas against extreme temperature swings. When the volcanic winter hit, inland temperatures might have plummeted 30 or 40 degrees. Coastal areas would have dropped too, but not as severely. More importantly, when the volcanic ash finally settled and the skies began to clear, inland areas faced wild temperature fluctuations. Scorching days followed by freezing nights. The coast remained relatively moderate, but temperature was just part of the equation. The real lifesaver was food. When the volcanic winter killed the grasslands, the herds died or migrated away. Plant foods became scarce. Freshwater sources froze or dried up. Inland populations faced catastrophic food shortages. The coast was different. Shellfish don't care if the sky is dark. Mussels, limpets, oysters, they kept right on living in the intertidal zones, filtering nutrients from the ocean. They were slow, they couldn't run away, and they were packed with protein and essential fatty acids. For desperate humans, they were salvation. The archaeological evidence from Pinnacle Point shows systematic shellfish exploitation. Not just occasional snacking, but organised harvesting. The cave deposits contain thousands upon thousands of shells, showing that these coastal groups had figured out something crucial. They had learned to manage marine resources sustainably. They weren't just grabbing everything they could find. They were harvesting selectively, probably understanding concepts like breeding seasons and size limits without ever articulating them as rules. This is sophisticated resource management. This is the beginning of what we'd now call conservation. But shellfish alone wouldn't have been enough. The coastal survivors needed protein, and they got it from the sea. Evidence from multiple coastal sites shows they were exploiting seals, hunting fish, possibly even scavenging beached whales. They developed specialized tools for marine foraging, stone points designed for spearing fish, tools for prying shellfish from rocks, scrapers for processing hides and preparing food, and they mastered fire in ways their ancestors never had. In a world where everything was damp from ocean spray and periodic storms, keeping fire alive was a constant challenge. The coastal survivors developed techniques we can only infer from archaeological evidence. They probably kept fires burning continuously, never letting them go out completely. They learned which woods burned hottest and longest. They figured out how to create protected hearths where flames could survive even in coastal winds. Fire wasn't just for warmth, it was technology, heating stones for cooking, hardening wooden tools, possibly smoking fish and meat for preservation. Every advance in fire management meant better survival odds, but survival takes more than food and fire. It takes people. And this is where the human survival story becomes really interesting. Because the coastal refugia weren't paradise. They were just slightly less horrible than everywhere else. Resources were still limited. Competition must have been intense. Under these conditions, you might expect humans to become more aggressive, more territorial, more willing to fight over scraps. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests they became more cooperative. How do we know this? From the tools. During the volcanic winter and its aftermath, stone tool technology shows increasing standardization. People across different sites were making similar tools in similar ways. This isn't genetic. Tools don't evolve through DNA. This is cultural transmission. People teaching other people. Knowledge flowing between groups. This tells us something profound. Even during the worst environmental crisis in human history, even when food was scarce and death was common, human groups were still communicating, still sharing information, still cooperating. Think about what this means. You're living in your coastal refuge, barely surviving. Another group lives 50 miles down the coast. You might see them once a year, maybe less. But when you do meet, you're not fighting. You're talking, sharing techniques for finding food, exchanging information about tool making, possibly trading raw materials, good quality stone for spear points, ochre for body decoration, shells that could be used as ornaments. This social network, fragile as it must have been, was probably as important to survival as food and fire. Because knowledge is cumulative. One group discovers that heating stone before chipping it makes better tools. They share this with another group who adds their own improvement. That innovation spreads through the network, making everyone more effective hunters and gatherers. This is uniquely human. Other species cooperate with family members, sometimes with non-relatives. But only humans build these extended social networks that can preserve and transmit knowledge across generations and geographic distances. The people living at Pinnacle Point 75,000 years ago were probably using techniques invented by other groups hundreds of miles away and passed along through chains of brief encounters. But cooperation required something else, something we don't often think about as a survival trait: trust. You can't have functioning trade networks without trust. You can't share knowledge if you're constantly suspicious of outsiders. You can't maintain long-distance relationships if every encounter might end in violence. The archaeological record suggests that volcanic winter survivors developed social mechanisms to build and maintain trust. We see evidence of symbolic behavior continuing through the crisis. Ochre, a red pigment made from iron-rich clay, shows up consistently in archaeological sites. Humans were still decorating themselves, still marking their identity. Pierced shells that could be strung as beads appear in multiple locations. These aren't practical survival tools. These are symbols, markers of identity, possibly indicators of group membership or individual status. Why does this matter? Because symbolic thinking is the foundation of complex society. If you can use a shell bead to represent group membership, you can use words to represent abstract concepts. You can create rituals that bind groups together. You can develop rules and norms that govern behavior, even when authority figures aren't present. The volcanic winter survivors weren't just physically tough, they were cognitively sophisticated. They could imagine futures that didn't exist yet. They could remember pasts they hadn't personally experienced. They could create mental models of other people's thoughts and intentions. These cognitive abilities, probably already present before Toba but refined under crisis conditions, let them maintain cooperation even under extreme stress. But let's be honest about what this cooperation looked like. This wasn't some peaceful utopia. People still died. Badly. Infant mortality must have been catastrophic. Most children probably didn't survive to adulthood. Adults faced constant threats from exposure, starvation, disease, and accidents. Violence between groups probably happened, especially when resources got scarce. The archaeological record shows evidence of trauma, healed fractures in bones, signs of violence on skeletal remains. Life was brutal, but here's what's remarkable. Despite all this, the social networks held. The knowledge kept flowing. The population didn't go extinct. Generation after generation, parents taught children the survival skills that had kept them alive. How to find water when springs froze, which plants were safe to eat and which would kill you, how to read weather patterns in a world where climate had gone mad, how to hunt successfully when prey was scarce and wary, how to make tools that could mean the difference between eating and starving. This knowledge preservation was probably humanity's most important survival adaptation. Every generation standing on the shoulders of the one before, accumulating tiny improvements that added up to the difference between extinction and survival, and they were innovating under pressure, creating new tools, developing new techniques. Evidence from this period shows the first compound tools, weapons made from multiple materials hafted together, spear points attached to wooden shafts with plant resin glue. This sounds simple, but it represents sophisticated planning. You need to gather materials from different locations. You need to understand the properties of stone, wood, and plant resins. You need to visualize the finished tool before you start making it. These were people who could plan multiple steps ahead, who could imagine solutions to problems they hadn't encountered yet. This kind of abstract reasoning, this ability to innovate under pressure, this is what kept them alive. But there's one more adaptation we need to talk about, the one that doesn't show up in bones or artifacts. Psychological resilience. Imagine living your entire life under grey skies, never seeing a proper sunset, never feeling true warmth from the sun, watching children die regularly, knowing that any year could be the one when the food runs out completely. Your grandmother told you it was better before. Your grandmother's grandmother said the world used to be green and warm, but you have no evidence of this. For all you know, grey skies and endless cold are just how the world is. How do you maintain hope in that situation? How do you keep going when you have no reason to believe things will ever improve? We can't excavate psychological states from archaeological sites, but we can make inferences. The fact that symbolic behaviour continued suggests people were still creating meaning, still engaging in activities beyond mere survival. The ochre and beads weren't necessary for staying alive. They were necessary for staying human, for maintaining identity and culture in the face of catastrophe. The continuous occupation of coastal sites suggests something even more profound. These people weren't giving up. They weren't lying down to die. They were doing everything possible to survive, generation after generation, even when the world seemed determined to kill them. This is the heart of the human survival story. Not that we're physically tougher than other species. We're not. Not that we're better adapted to extreme climates. We're actually pretty pathetic compared to animals that evolved for cold. What kept humans alive through 117,000 years of near extinction was stubbornness. The refusal to accept that this was the end. The determination to try one more thing, make one more tool, share one more piece of knowledge, raise one more child in the hope that maybe, somehow, the world would get better. And here's the thing. They were right. The world did get better. Eventually. But that's still thousands of years in the future. For now, your ancestors were just trying to make it through another day in the frozen world. Trying to find enough food to feed the children. Trying to keep the fire burning. Trying to remember the stories that gave them hope. They succeeded. And because they did, you're here reading this. Every human alive today descends from people who refused to quit when quitting would have been so much easier. We're all children of the coastal survivors, all carriers of genes that endured the volcanic winter, all products of cooperation and innovation under the worst conditions imaginable. The frozen world couldn't kill them, and what came next would prove they had been forged into something extraordinary. But while our scattered ancestors clung to survival in their African refuges, the rest of the planet was transforming into something unrecognizable, something alien, something that would make the volcanic winter look like a warm-up act. The ice was coming, not all at once, not like a switch being flipped, but year by year, decade by decade, century by century, the ice sheets were growing, snow falling in northern latitudes that never quite melted in the brief summers. Each winter adding another layer, compressing the snow beneath into glacial ice. The weight building, the ice spreading, flowing outward like frozen rivers in slow motion. Within a few thousand years of Toba's eruption, the world had entered full glacial conditions. And when I say full glacial, I don't mean it snowed a lot. I mean ice sheets 3 kilometers thick covering vast portions of the northern hemisphere. Ice so heavy it literally pressed the Earth's crust downward, creating depressions that still exist today. Picture Canada completely buried under ice. Not just the northern parts, but everything from the Arctic Ocean down to where New York City is today. An ice sheet larger than Antarctica, grinding slowly southward, scraping away everything in its path. Mountains, forests, the accumulated soil of millions of years, all of it pulverized under miles of ice. Northern Europe was the same, ice covering Scandinavia, Britain, Germany. The North Sea and Baltic Sea didn't exist, just ice. Solid ice connecting what we now think of as separate land masses. If you had stood at the edge of this ice sheet, which probably wasn't a great idea, you would have seen a wall of blue-white ice stretching up into the clouds, cliffs of ice carving off massive chunks that crashed down with the force of small earthquakes. Asia had its own ice sheets. The Himalayas and surrounding mountain ranges were encased in ice far beyond anything we see today, glaciers extending hundreds of miles from peaks, merging into ice fields that covered the Tibetan Plateau. But here's what's really mind-bending. All that ice had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was the ocean. Each year, snow fell on the ice sheets. Each year, that snow turned to ice. Each year, water that would normally cycle back to the ocean stayed locked up on land in frozen form. The ocean levels dropped, not a little, not a few feet, 120 meters. That's nearly 400 feet. Imagine standing on a beach today and looking out at the ocean, then draining it until you're standing 400 feet above the new shoreline. That's how much the sea level fell during the peak of the Ice Age. And when the ocean retreats that far, everything changes. The English Channel didn't exist. What we now call Britain was connected to continental Europe by a broad grassy plain. You could have walked from London to Paris without getting your feet wet. In fact, animals did exactly that. Herds of horses, reindeer and bison migrating across what we now think of as the seafloor. The Bering Strait between Asia and North America, gone. In its place was Beringia, a land bridge hundreds of miles wide connecting two continents. Not just a narrow crossing, but an entire subcontinent that stretched from Siberia to Alaska. Grasslands and tundra supporting vast herds of animals, and eventually humans. Indonesia wasn't a chain of islands. It was Sundaland, a vast peninsula extending out from mainland Asia. You could walk from Vietnam to Borneo without ever seeing the ocean. Australia and New Guinea were connected in a single landmass called Sahul. The world map looked completely different. Coastlines we'd recognise today simply didn't exist. What we think of as separate continents were connected. What we think of as dry land was deep beneath the ice. And into this transformed world came creatures that seem almost mythical today. The megafauna of the Ice Age, animals so large, so strange, that if we saw them today, we'd think we were looking at movie monsters. But they were real, and they were everywhere. Woolly mammoths, the iconic symbol of the Ice Age, weren't just bigger elephants with fur. They were perfectly engineered survival machines. That shaggy coat wasn't just for show. It was a sophisticated insulation system with two layers, an outer coat of guard hairs that could grow up to 3 feet long, and an inner layer of dense underwool. Beneath that, a layer of fat up to 4 inches thick. They could survive temperatures that would kill modern elephants in hours. Their tusks, curving dramatically forward, weren't primarily weapons. They were tools. Mammoths used them to sweep away snow to reach the dried grasses beneath. Paleontologists have found mammoth tusks worn down from years of use as snow shovels. They were digging their dinner out of the frozen ground every single day. And they weren't small. Bulls could stand 11 feet at the shoulder and weigh 6 tons. Imagine an animal twice as tall as human and as heavy as 3 cars. Now imagine herds of them, hundreds strong, migrating across the tundra, following the seasonal grasses. But mammoths were just the beginning. Giant ground sloths in the Americas could stand 12 feet tall on their hind legs. These weren't the slow-moving tree-dwellers we know today. These were terrestrial behemoths with claws like scimitars that could disembowel a predator with a single swipe. Saber-toothed cats prowled the Ice Age landscapes with canine teeth up to 7 inches long. But those famous teeth weren't for biting. They were precision killing instruments. Saber-tooths would use their incredibly powerful forelimbs to wrestle prey to the ground, then deliver a surgical strike to the throat, those long teeth sliding between vertebrae to sever the spinal cord. Quick, efficient, terrifying. Cave bears in Europe grew larger than modern grizzlies. Despite the name, they weren't just bears that happened to live in caves. They were an entirely different species that had evolved to use caves as year-round shelters, not just winter dens. Generations of cave bears living and dying in the same caverns, leaving behind bone deposits so thick that medieval Europeans mined them, thinking they'd found dragon lairs, woolly rhinoceroses, giant elk with antlers spanning 12 feet, cave lions bigger than any cat alive today, the short-faced bear, the largest carnivorous land mammal in North America, standing 6 feet at the shoulder, on all fours and possibly 12 feet when upright. This was the world humans had to navigate, not as apex predators, not yet, but as clever opportunists trying to make a living in an ecosystem dominated by animals that could kill them without much effort. And somehow, impossibly, during these harshest of conditions, humans not only survived but expanded. Those small groups that had made it through the bottleneck and the volcanic winter, their descendants were on the move, spreading out from Africa, adapting to Ice Age conditions, colonizing territories that should have been uninhabitable. By 40,000 years ago, humans had reached Europe, not just the warmer southern regions, but deep into the frozen north. Archaeological sites in Siberia show humans living within a few hundred miles of the ice sheets themselves. What kind of adaptations made this possible? The evidence is written in the archaeological record, carefully crafted bone needles, some no thicker than modern sewing needles. These weren't decorative items, they were survival tools. With needles, humans could create tailored clothing, not just animal hides draped over their bodies, but sophisticated garments designed to trap air for insulation, shed water, and protect against the killing wind. Nobody knows exactly what Ice Age clothing looked like, but we can make educated guesses based on modern Arctic peoples. Layered garments, inner layers of soft fur against the skin, outer layers of water-resistant hide, hoods, mittens, boots, drawstrings and ties to seal out the cold. Without this technology, humans in northern latitudes would have died of exposure within hours. Shelter was equally crucial. The archaeological record shows sophisticated, constructed dwellings, not just caves, though humans certainly used those, but purpose-built structures made from mammoth bones and tusks covered with hides. Some of these dwellings used hundreds of mammoth bones, requiring coordinated group effort to construct. They had hearths, storage pits, even what might be sleeping platforms. At Mezheritch in Ukraine, archaeologists found the remains of a mammoth bone house that was 15 feet across. The bones were arranged in a circular pattern with a clear entrance. Inside, remains of hearths showed it had been heated. Outside, storage pits contained preserved meat. This wasn't temporary camping, this was architecture. Humans engineering their environment to survive conditions that should have killed them. And they were hunting the megafauna, not just scavenging, actively hunting animals many times their size. The evidence is undeniable. Mammoth kill sites show systematic butchery, stone spear points embedded in extinct bison bones, pit traps designed to capture large game. But how? How do you kill a 6-ton mammoth with Stone Age technology? Very carefully, and with a level of planning and cooperation that suggests sophisticated social organisation. Some researchers think humans drove mammoths into natural traps, bogs or steep-sided ravines where the animals' weight worked against them. Others think they used fire to stampede herds toward kill zones where hunters waited with spears. The most dramatic theory suggests humans attacked mammoths in winter when the animals were weakened by cold and hunger, multiple hunters working together to inflict bleeding wounds, and then tracking the animal until it collapsed from blood loss. Whatever the specific techniques, the result was clear. Humans became specialists in megafauna hunting. A single mammoth kill could feed a group of 30 people for months. The meat was food, the fat was fuel for lamps, the bones were building materials, the tusks were tools. Nothing was wasted, everything was essential. But perhaps the most remarkable evidence of Ice Age human life comes from something completely unexpected. Art. Deep in the caves of southern France and northern Spain, humans created some of the most stunning artistic achievements in our species' history. The cave paintings at Lascaux, Chauvet and Altamira aren't primitive scribbles. They're masterpieces, horses rendered in perfect anatomical detail, bison captured mid-motion with a sense of movement that rivals anything produced by classical civilizations, lions, rhinoceroses, mammoths, all painted with sophisticated techniques including shading, perspective, and the use of the cave wall's natural contours to create three-dimensional effects. At Chauvet Cave, the paintings date to 36,000 years ago. That's humans creating sophisticated art while living under Ice Age conditions, while hunting mammoths for survival, while the world outside was frozen and hostile. They still found time and energy to go deep into caves, create pigments from minerals and animal fats, and paint by the flickering light of fat-burning lamps. What does this tell us? That even in the harshest conditions imaginable, humans maintained rich inner lives. They had mythology, religion, or at least symbolic thinking complex enough to warrant elaborate artistic expression. They weren't just surviving, they were creating culture. But the Ice Age wasn't constant. Within the overall frozen period, the climate fluctuated in cycles that made survival even more challenging. Scientists call these fluctuations stadials and interstadials, colder periods and slightly warmer periods that punctuated the millennia. During stadials, the ice sheets would expand, temperatures would plummet even further, resources would become scarce. Human populations probably contracted during these periods, retreating to refugia where conditions were marginally more survivable. Then interstadials would arrive, brief periods, maybe lasting only a few centuries, when temperatures would rise slightly. The ice sheets would retreat a little, grasslands would expand, animal populations would recover, and humans would expand outward again, recolonizing territories that had been too harsh during the stadial. This constant cycling, this environmental yo-yo, kept human populations under perpetual selection pressure. You couldn't just adapt to Ice Age conditions and call it good. You had to be adaptable to change itself. Groups that could quickly shift strategies, move to new territories, exploit new resources, they survived. Groups that couldn't, they went extinct. And all of this, all these adaptations and innovations and artistic achievements happened during what was fundamentally a planetary crisis. A world still recovering from volcanic catastrophe. A world locked in ice. A world that by any reasonable standard should have been uninhabitable for a tropical species like humans. But we didn't just inhabit it, we spread across it, we mastered it, and we did it alongside other human species who were doing the same thing in their own ways, with their own strategies, in their own territories. The stage was set for something unprecedented. Multiple human species, all descended from bottleneck survivors, all adapted to extreme conditions, all competing for the same resources in a world of ice. What happened when they finally met would determine which version of humanity would inherit the Earth. But your ancestors weren't alone in the frozen world, not by a long shot. While they huddled in their African refuges, struggling to survive the volcanic winter and the ice age that followed, another human species had already been thriving in the cold for hundreds of thousands of years. They were stockier than your ancestors, stronger, with bodies built like wrestlers and brains, actually larger than modern humans. They had conquered Ice Age Europe when your people were still trying to figure out how to survive in the tropics. They were the Neanderthals, and they were magnificent. Picture Europe 60,000 years ago. Glaciers covered Scandinavia, pushing down like slow-motion tsunamis of ice. The Mediterranean was colder, windier, nothing like the sunny paradise it is today. And yet, in caves scattered from Spain to Siberia. Neanderthal families were not just surviving, but genuinely living. They had been doing this for over 300,000 years. Your ancestors had maybe 200,000 years of existence as a species. Neanderthals had been mastering the Ice Age while your people were still evolving. And master it they did. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of humans who had adapted to cold environments in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. Those robust bodies weren't just for show. Neanderthals had barrel chests to house massive lungs, shorter limbs to conserve heat, and incredibly dense bones from a lifetime of physical exertion that would break a modern human. Their nasal passages were enormous, specifically evolved to warm and humidify the frigid air before it reached their lungs. Everything about them screamed cold weather specialist. But it was their minds that were really remarkable. For decades, scientists assumed Neanderthals were dim-witted brutes, evolutionary dead ends who got outcompeted by smarter modern humans. That story is complete nonsense. The evidence shows Neanderthals were sophisticated hunters with detailed knowledge of animal behaviour, seasonal patterns and landscape features. They didn't just chase down prey and hope for the best. They planned. They strategized. They coordinated. Archaeological sites show evidence of systematic hunting of massive Ice Age mammals, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears. These weren't animals you could just club over the head and call it dinner. Taking down a mammoth required teamwork, communication, probably days of planning and tracking. It required understanding animal psychology well enough to predict behavior and manipulate it. Neanderthals developed specialized spears with stone points, hafted to wooden shafts using birch tar, which they had to manufacture by heating birch bark under specific controlled conditions. This is chemistry. This is engineering. This is the kind of abstract problem-solving that supposedly only modern humans could do. And they cared for each other in ways that challenge everything we thought we knew about human uniqueness. Multiple Neanderthal skeletons show evidence of severe injuries that had healed, broken bones that were set properly and given time to mend, infections that were survived with help. One famous skeleton from Iraq, an older individual, had so many healed injuries that he must have been cared for by his group for years. He was missing an eye, had a withered arm, probably couldn't hunt effectively anymore, but his people kept him alive. They fed him, protected him, valued him despite his inability to contribute physically to survival. This is compassion. This is culture. This is exactly what we like to think makes humans special. Except Neanderthals were doing it 50,000 years ago, in caves lit by flickering firelight, while glaciers ground across the landscape outside. There's even evidence they might have been artists. Cave paintings in Spain that were dated to before modern humans arrived in Europe, suggesting Neanderthals were creating symbolic art. Red ochre found at Neanderthal sites, possibly used for body decoration. Perforated shells that might have been worn as jewellery. We can't be completely certain these were Neanderthal creations, the dating is tricky, but the possibility is tantalising. The idea that our cousins weren't just surviving, but creating beauty in a frozen world. And then there were the Denisovans, possibly the most mysterious cousins of all. We know them almost entirely from DNA because they left almost no fossils. A few teeth, a piece of jawbone, fragments of finger bones found in a cave in Siberia. That's it. That's the entire physical evidence for an entire human species that once ranged from Siberia to Southeast Asia, from the frozen north to tropical islands. But their DNA tells an incredible story. Denisovans weren't just another variant of Neanderthals. They were a separate species that split off from our common ancestor maybe 400,000 years ago. They adapted to environments so diverse it's hard to believe they were the same species. Some Denisovan populations lived in the freezing mountains of Tibet, developing genetic adaptations to high altitude that modern Tibetans still carry today. These genes help process oxygen more efficiently when the air is thin, a survival advantage that's still providing benefits tens of thousands of years after the Denisovans themselves disappeared. Other Denisovan groups seem to have been maritime specialists. Their DNA shows up in populations from Papua New Guinea and Australia, places that could only be reached by crossing significant stretches of open ocean even during Ice Age low sea levels. This suggests Denisovans developed sophisticated boat building and navigation technologies, possibly before modern humans did. They were innovating, adapting, conquering new environments just like Neanderthals, just like your ancestors. So you have 3 human species, all intelligent, all adapted to survive in challenging environments, all with their own cultures and technologies. And then, around 60,000 years ago, they started meeting each other. Modern humans finally expanding out of Africa, moving into territories that Neanderthals and Denisovans had called home for hundreds of thousands of years. The traditional story says modern humans arrived with superior technology and intelligence, outcompeted the other species, and drove them to extinction within a few thousand years, clean, simple, and almost certainly wrong. The real story is far more complicated and far more interesting. Because here's what we know for certain. They didn't just compete, they had sex. The genetic evidence is undeniable. Most people of European and Asian descent carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. People from Papua New Guinea, Australia, and parts of Southeast Asia carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Some populations in East Asia carry DNA from both. This wasn't just one interbreeding event. The genetic patterns show multiple episodes of interbreeding happening over thousands of years in different locations. Think about what this means. Different human species, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, different enough to be classified as separate species, but still similar enough to produce fertile offspring. This is remarkable. Most species that diverge from a common ancestor become reproductively incompatible relatively quickly. The fact that humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans could still interbreed after 400,000 years of separate evolution suggests something unique about our lineage. And the genes they gave us weren't random junk DNA. Natural selection kept specific Neanderthal and Denisovan genes because they provided survival advantages, genes affecting skin and hair, possibly helping modern humans adapt to the colder climates they were entering, genes affecting the immune system, providing resistance to diseases that had been circulating in Europe and Asia for millennia, but that African humans had never encountered. The Denisovan high-altitude genes in Tibetans that let them live comfortably at elevations that would leave most people gasping for breath. We are literally walking around with ancient survival adaptations from extinct human species coded into our DNA. Every time someone of European descent fights off an infection, there's a chance they're using molecular machinery inherited from a Neanderthal ancestor 50,000 years ago. Every time a Tibetan Sherpa guides climbers up Mount Everest, they're using genetic tools developed by Denisovans in the frozen mountains of the Pleistocene. But here's the question that haunts anyone who studies this period. If Neanderthals and Denisovans were so successful, so well adapted, so intelligent, why did they disappear? Why are we here and they're not? Why did Homo sapiens become the last human standing while our cousins vanished into extinction? The answers are complicated and probably multiple. Competition for resources definitely played a role. As modern humans expanded into Europe and Asia, they would have been competing directly with Neanderthals and Denisovans for the same prey animals, the same cave shelters, the same territories. Modern humans had some advantages, possibly better long-distance hunting weapons like the atlatl, possibly more sophisticated social networks that could mobilize larger groups. Even small advantages compound over thousands of years. Climate change almost certainly contributed. The period between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago saw dramatic climate fluctuations. Neanderthals and Denisovans had survived climate change before. They'd been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years, but adding competition from modern humans while also dealing with environmental stress might have been too much. Populations that were already stretched thin might have been pushed past the breaking point. There's also the numbers game. Modern human populations expanding out of Africa were growing exponentially. Even if Neanderthals and Denisovans were individually just as capable, they might have simply been outnumbered. Genetic evidence suggests Neanderthal populations were always relatively small, maybe never more than a few tens of thousands, across all of Europe and Western Asia. Modern humans had the entire African continent as a population reservoir, potentially millions of individuals who could send wave after wave of migrants into new territories. And there's the uncomfortable possibility that modern humans didn't just outcompete our cousins, we might have actively hunted them. We have no direct evidence of this, no ancient battlefields, no weapons stuck in Neanderthal bones. But we know modern humans are capable of violence against other human groups. There's no particular reason to think our ancestors would have been any different, especially when encountering beings that looked almost but not quite human. The truth is probably some combination of all these factors. Competition, climate change, demographics, possibly violence, all happening simultaneously over thousands of years. Different Neanderthal and Denisovan populations might have disappeared for different reasons at different times. Some might have been absorbed into modern human populations through interbreeding. Others might have been displaced to marginal environments, where they couldn't sustain viable populations. Still others might have been actively killed. What we know is that by 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were disappearing from their Western European strongholds. By 30,000 years ago, they were gone entirely, the last populations holding on in caves in Gibraltar and the Caucasus before finally vanishing. The Denisovans disappeared even earlier from most of their range, though some populations might have survived in isolated pockets until as recently as 15,000 years ago. And then there was only one human species left. Not the oldest, not the most cold adapted, not the ones with the biggest brains or the strongest bodies. The ones who'd been forged in the African crucible of climate catastrophe, who'd survived the Toba bottleneck and the subsequent ice age by becoming the most adaptable, most innovative, most successful colonizers the planet had ever seen. But we carry our cousins with us, written into our genes. Every red-haired person of European descent might be expressing a colour variant inherited from Neanderthals. Every person who fights off disease is potentially using immune system genes refined in Ice Age Europe. Every Tibetan breathing thin mountain air is using Denisovan lungs. We are the last humans, but we are not pure. We are a blend, a mixture, the result of multiple human species coming together in one final genetic convergence before the others disappeared forever. And sometimes, late at night, when I think about those last Neanderthals in their Gibraltar caves, watching the world change around them, knowing somehow that they were the last, I wonder what they thought. Did they know they were disappearing? Did they remember the stories of when their people had been numerous and strong? Did they mourn their extinction? Or did they simply do what all living things do and try to survive one more day? We'll never know. But we carry their legacy forward whether we want to or not. The last humans walking through a world that once held such astonishing diversity. A world that was once home to many kinds of human, all of them remarkable in their own ways, all of them ultimately doomed except for us. The survivors of Africa, the last great species, carrying forward the genes and dreams of all our vanished cousins. Around 20,000 years ago, something shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously. But if you'd been standing on the ice sheets that covered half the northern hemisphere, if you'd been one of the humans scratching out survival in the Ice Age world, you might have noticed. Subtle things. The sun sitting just slightly higher in the sky at midsummer, the glacial edge not advancing quite as far south during winter, meltwater streams running just a few days longer before freezing solid. The change was orbital. Earth's axis tilts on a cycle that takes 41,000 years to complete. Its orbit around the sun shifts from circular to elliptical and back again over 100,000 years. These Milankovitch cycles, named after the Serbian mathematician who figured them out, control the amount of solar radiation hitting different parts of the planet at different times of year. For the past 100,000 years, these cycles have been aligned to minimize summer sunlight in the northern hemisphere. That's what allowed the ice sheets to grow. Even a tiny reduction in summer warmth means last winter's snow doesn't completely melt. The leftover snow gets compressed into ice. Year after year, the ice accumulates. After 100,000 years, you get ice sheets 2 miles thick covering Canada and Scandinavia. But now the cycles were shifting. Summer sunlight was increasing. Just a few percentage points. Just enough that each summer, slightly more ice melted than had the year before. The balance had tipped. The Ice Age was ending. Except it didn't end gradually. Nothing in nature that massive and unstable ends gradually. The ice sheets had been building for 100,000 years. They contained enough frozen water to lower global sea levels by 400 feet. That water was locked up in ice domes so tall they created their own weather system, so heavy they had literally pressed the Earth's crust down hundreds of feet under their weight. When that much ice starts to collapse, it doesn't just melt. It catastrophically disintegrates. Picture this. The edge of the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacier covering North America, stretches across what's now the northern United States. Behind it, trapped between the ice and the mountains, is a lake. Not a normal lake. A lake the size of the Great Lakes combined, filled with ice-cold meltwater, held back only by a dam made of ice. Every summer the lake grows as more ice melts. The ice dam gets weaker, more unstable. Then one day it fails. Billions of tons of water explode across the landscape in a matter of days. The flood is so massive it can be seen from space, if there were anyone in space to see it. Icebergs the size of cities are carried hundreds of miles downstream. The torrent carves canyons in hours that would normally take millions of years to form. Everything in its path, forests, animals, human settlements, gets swept away in a wall of water and ice moving at highway speeds. This happened repeatedly as the ice sheets collapsed. Geologists have found evidence of dozens of these superfloods, these glacial lake outbursts that reshaped entire regions in days or weeks. The channeled scablands of Washington state were carved by one such flood. The Baltic Sea basin was scoured by another. Every coastline on Earth was redrawn as billions of gallons of meltwater returned to the oceans, raising sea levels 400 feet over 10,000 years. For humans living through this, the world was literally transforming around them. Territories that had been ice-covered tundra for millennia were suddenly becoming grasslands, then forests. Animal populations were shifting, migrating north following the retreating ice. The megafauna that had dominated the Ice Age world, mammoths, mastodons, woolly rhinos, giant ground sloths, were finding their habitats vanishing beneath them. And humans, battle-hardened, climate-tested, evolutionarily refined humans, they followed the changing landscape north. They tracked the migrating herds. They explored newly ice-free valleys. They adapted their technologies and strategies to a world that was warming rapidly in geological terms but still achingly slowly in human ones. A person born into this transitional world might have seen slightly less ice at the end of their life than at the beginning, but they wouldn't have experienced it as dramatic change. It was their grandchildren's grandchildren who would notice the difference. The warming wasn't smooth. Climate during deglaciation was chaotic, unstable, prone to wild swings. The most dramatic swing came around 12,900 years ago, just when it seemed the Ice Age was finally ending for good. The Younger Dryas event, named after an Arctic flower that suddenly reappeared across Europe in sediment layers from this time. In less than a decade, maybe as quickly as a single year, temperatures plunged back to near Ice Age conditions. The warming trend that had been building for 8,000 years reversed almost overnight. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. Forests that had been expanding died back. Animal populations crashed. And humans who had begun adapting to a warmer world suddenly found themselves fighting for survival again. The cause was probably catastrophic. Most scientists think a massive ice dam in North America failed, releasing so much fresh water into the North Atlantic that it disrupted the ocean circulation patterns that distribute heat around the globe. The Gulf Stream, which carries tropical warmth to northern Europe, either shut down or dramatically weakened. Northern Hemisphere temperatures dropped by 15 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions. Winter returned with a vengeance. For over 1,000 years, the Younger Dryas freeze lasted. Entire human generations were born, lived and died, knowing only stories from their grandparents about the brief warming that had seemed so promising. Some populations probably went extinct during this reversal, groups that had specialized too much for the warming conditions and couldn't adapt back to the cold. But others survived, drawing on the deep well of adaptability that had carried them through 100,000 years of Ice Age challenges. Archaeological sites from the Younger Dryas period show humans hunching down, becoming more mobile, diversifying their food sources. They couldn't rely on large game anymore because the herds were smaller and less predictable. So they started exploiting everything: small mammals, fish, birds, insects, wild plants. They developed new technologies for processing difficult foods, grinding stones for seeds, nets for fishing, specialized tools for hunting waterfowl. They were innovating fast, adapting to survive yet another climate catastrophe. And then, 11,700 years ago, it ended. Not gradually this time, but abruptly. Within a few decades, global temperatures shot up. The ice sheets resumed their collapse. Sea levels began rising again. But this time, something was different. The climate didn't just warm, it stabilized. Welcome to the Holocene, the geological epoch we're still living in. For the first time in 100,000 years, Earth's climate became remarkably stable. Not unchanging, there were still droughts and floods and cold snaps, but nothing like the wild swings of the Ice Age. Temperatures stayed within a narrow range. Rainfall patterns became predictable. Seasons became regular enough that you could actually plan around them. This stability was the precondition for everything that came after. For 100,000 years, humans had been too busy surviving to build anything permanent. Why invest in long-term settlements when climate might shift dramatically within a generation? Why develop agriculture when you might have to migrate hundreds of miles following game animals as their ranges shifted? You can't plan for the future when the future is unpredictable. But in the Holocene, the future became predictable. You could observe that rains came at certain times, that rivers flooded on schedule, that certain plants grew reliably in certain places year after year, and humans finally could stop running. They could settle, they could plant, they could build. The transition wasn't universal or instant. Some populations adopted agriculture within a few thousand years of the Holocene's beginning. Others remained hunter-gatherers for millennia longer, but the possibility was there in a way it had never been before. In the Middle East, people began cultivating wheat and barley. In China, rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, squash and maize. Different crops, different regions, but the same fundamental innovation. Humans taking control of their food supply, shaping the landscape to their needs, rather than adapting to whatever nature provided. This required a complete psychological shift. For 300,000 years, humans had been migrants, following resources, moving with the seasons. Now they had to think in years, in generations. You plant seeds now that you harvest months later. You invest labor clearing fields that your children will benefit from. You store grain that might feed you through next winter. Agriculture required delayed gratification, long-term planning, faith in the future, and it required stable climate. Without the Holocene's predictability, none of it works. But there was a cost to this new stable world. As humans expanded into newly ice-free territories, as they developed new hunting technologies, as their populations exploded in the resource-rich Holocene environment, the megafauna began disappearing. Mammoths vanished from North America around 11,000 years ago. Giant ground sloths went extinct around the same time. In Australia, the giant marsupials disappeared. In Europe, the woolly rhinoceros and cave bears vanished. Were humans responsible? Partially, probably. We were efficient predators armed with increasingly sophisticated weapons, expanding into territories where animals had never encountered human hunters before. The naive megafauna, creatures that had survived multiple ice ages, couldn't adapt fast enough to this new threat. But the changing climate played a role too. The grasslands and tundra that supported these giant herbivores were transforming into forests. Their food sources were vanishing even as human pressure increased. The result was a wave of extinctions that swept across the planet as the Ice Age ended. By 10,000 years ago, most of the spectacular megafauna that had dominated Ice Age ecosystems were gone. The planet was entering a new ecological era, one dominated not by giant mammals, but by a single medium-sized primate with an oversized brain and an unprecedented capacity for reshaping its environment. But here's what keeps me up at night thinking about this period: how close we came to missing it entirely. The Holocene stable climate was a lucky break, a brief window of predictability in Earth's normally chaotic climate history. If the genetic bottleneck 900,000 years earlier had been slightly more severe, if those 1,280 survivors had been reduced to 500 or 200, or if the right combination of disasters had struck and left no survivors at all, there would have been no humans around to take advantage of the Holocene stability. The ice would have melted anyway. The climate would have stabilized anyway. The megafauna would have gone extinct from climate change alone, but there would have been no agriculture, no cities, no writing, no civilization. Earth would have entered its current warm period as just another planet with interesting wildlife, nothing more. We made it by the narrowest possible margin. We survived because 1,280 individuals, scattered across Africa 900,000 years ago, were tough enough and smart enough and lucky enough to keep reproducing through 117,000 years of environmental hell. We made it because their descendants survived another 900,000 years of ice ages and volcanic winters and climate catastrophes. We made it because when the ice finally released its grip, when the climate finally stabilized, there were still humans around to notice the opportunity and seize it. Within 5,000 years of the Holocene's beginning, humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. Within 10,000 years, they had domesticated dozens of plant and animal species. Within 12,000 years, they were building cities, inventing writing, creating civilizations that would eventually reach the stars, all because the ice finally melted, all because the climate finally stabilized, all because we survived long enough to see it happen. But the question remains, what happens when the stability ends? So here we are. You've just heard the story of how your ancestors survived the worst climate disaster in human history, how they endured the Toba eruption, fought through 117,000 years of near extinction, and eventually emerged to populate the entire planet. But what does it all mean? What can we learn from those desperate millennia when everything hung in the balance and somehow, impossibly, humanity survived? The first lesson is the most obvious, but also the most profound. We are tougher than we think. Your ancestors lived through conditions that would break most modern humans in days, years without seeing the sun, decades of failed harvests, generations where losing half your children to starvation was considered normal. They had no heated shelters, no stored food supplies, no government relief agencies to help when disaster struck. Just their intelligence, their tools, and each other, and they made it. Not easily, not without tremendous suffering and loss, but they survived. Every person alive today carries that survival capacity in their DNA. We are literally the descendants of the most resilient humans who ever lived, individuals who were tested under the harshest conditions imaginable and didn't break. When you feel like you can't handle whatever challenge you're facing, remember that your genes survived the Toba bottleneck. You're tougher than you know because toughness is what got you here. But the bottleneck also left us vulnerable in ways we're only beginning to understand. That dramatic reduction in genetic diversity, from perhaps 100,000 individuals down to 1,280, fundamentally changed human biology. Today, humans have significantly less genetic variation than most other large mammals. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have more genetic diversity in a single troop than exists in all 8 billion humans alive today. This matters more than you might think. Low genetic diversity makes species vulnerable to diseases. With less variation, there's a higher chance that a single pathogen could exploit genetic weaknesses shared by many individuals. It's why the 1918 flu pandemic killed 50 million people, why COVID-19 spread so rapidly, why certain genetic diseases appear at higher rates in humans than they probably would in a species with greater diversity. Medical researchers studying human genetics keep running into this bottleneck signature. They find gene variants that should be rare appearing at surprisingly high frequencies. They discover that humans are unusually susceptible to certain diseases compared to other primates. The reason, in many cases, traces back to that event 900,000 years ago when human genetic diversity collapsed and never fully recovered. We're also vulnerable to inbreeding depression in ways most people don't realize. The bottleneck forced human populations into small, isolated groups for thousands of generations. This created genetic patterns that still affect us today. Some populations show higher rates of recessive genetic disorders because their ancestors spent so long in small, relatively isolated groups where everyone was related to everyone else. But here's what's really unsettling. We're not out of the woods. The lesson of the Ice Age isn't just about what happened then. It's about what could happen now. Today, we face climate change again. Not cooling this time, but warming. And it's happening fast. Faster than anything in the geological record except for the immediate aftermath of major volcanic eruptions. We're conducting a global experiment with our planet's climate, pushing it into territory it hasn't seen for millions of years. The parallels to the Ice Age aren't exact, but they're close enough to be terrifying. Our ancestors survived cooling because they could migrate toward the equator, following the habitable zones as they shifted south. But warming? Where do you migrate when the entire planet is heating up? When the equatorial regions become too hot to support large human populations, where do people go? There are no refugia from global warming, no safe valleys where a few thousand people can wait it out until things improve. And we've made ourselves more vulnerable in other ways. Our ancestors lived in small, dispersed groups. A disaster in one location couldn't wipe out the whole species. Today we've concentrated ourselves into massive urban centres, cities of 10, 20, 30 million people, all dependent on complex supply chains that can collapse if just one critical system fails. We've traded resilience for efficiency, and we might come to regret that choice. Then there are the supervolcanoes. They're still out there, still building pressure, still capable of triggering the same kind of catastrophe that nearly destroyed us before. Yellowstone is the one everyone knows about. It sits on top of a massive magma chamber that's been building for hundreds of thousands of years. When it last erupted 640,000 years ago, it ejected enough ash to bury Texas under 3 feet of volcanic debris. The next eruption could be even larger. Geologists monitor it constantly, tracking ground deformation, earthquake swarms, changes in gas emissions. So far, nothing suggests an imminent eruption, but imminent in geological terms could mean any time in the next 100,000 years. It could be tomorrow, or consider Campi Flegrei in Italy, right next to Naples, a city of 3 million people. This volcanic system has been showing increased activity recently. Ground uplift, more frequent earthquakes, changes in gas composition. Some volcanologists think it might be entering the early stages of a new eruption cycle. If it blows with anywhere near the intensity of past eruptions, it could devastate southern Europe and trigger a global cooling event. Or Taupo in New Zealand, which produced the most violent eruption of the last 70,000 years. Or the volcanic systems under Antarctica, which we barely understand but which might be capable of truly catastrophic eruptions. The list goes on. We've identified at least 20 volcanic systems worldwide that could theoretically produce Toba-scale eruptions. The question isn't if one will erupt, it's when and whether we'll be ready. And honestly, we probably won't be ready. We've built a civilization that's incredibly powerful but also incredibly fragile. We depend on global supply chains for food, fuel, and medicine. We've concentrated our populations in cities that would become uninhabitable in a volcanic winter. We've created technologies that require stable conditions to function. Hit us with a Toba-scale eruption, and modern civilization wouldn't necessarily collapse, but it would be stressed in ways we've never experienced before. But the Ice Age also teaches us something hopeful, something that might be the most important lesson of all. The thing that saved our ancestors wasn't physical strength or speed or any other biological advantage, it was cooperation. Think about what that means. During the bottleneck, every human alive was part of extended networks of mutual support. They shared food when times were good. They took care of each other's children. They passed knowledge between generations. They maintained trading relationships with groups they might only see once every few years. This wasn't altruism. It was survival strategy. Groups that cooperated had higher survival rates than those that didn't. Natural selection literally bred cooperation into our genes. We evolved to be the most cooperative large mammal on Earth. Our capacity for trust, for empathy, for working together towards shared goals, these aren't cultural artifacts that we can discard when they become inconvenient. They're core features of human biology, adaptations that were refined during those brutal millennia when cooperation was the difference between survival and extinction. This is why humans can organize into groups of thousands, millions, billions. Why we can create governments, institutions, systems of law and trade that span the globe. Why we can tackle problems that no individual could solve alone. We inherited the social tools that kept our ancestors alive when everything else failed, and we're going to need those tools again. The challenges we face today, climate change, pandemic disease, environmental degradation, nuclear proliferation, none of them can be solved by individuals acting alone. They require cooperation at scales our ancestors never imagined. But the capacity for that cooperation is already in us, written into our DNA by 117,000 years of intense natural selection. The philosophical implications of this are staggering when you really think about them. Every human being alive today descends from that tiny population of survivors. We're all, literally, cousins. The genetic diversity between any two humans chosen at random is tiny compared to the diversity between two random chimpanzees or wolves or elephants. We're one family, united by our shared descent from those few thousand individuals who refused to give up when the world turned against them. This should change how we see each other. The person sitting next to you on the bus, the stranger you passed on the street, the people living on the other side of the world whose names you'll never know. You share ancestors with all of them. Not distant ancestors from millions of years ago, but relatively recent ancestors who lived through the same catastrophe, who faced the same desperate struggle for survival. We carry their resilience in our genes, their intelligence in our minds, their capacity for cooperation in our social instincts. We are the product of the greatest survival story ever told, living proof that even when everything goes wrong, even when extinction seems certain, life finds a way. And here's the really mind-blowing part. The fact that you exist at all is absurdly improbable. Your ancestors survived the Toba eruption. They survived 117,000 years of climate chaos. They survived the expansion and competition with other human species. They survived the last glacial maximum when ice sheets covered a third of the planet. They survived plagues, famines, wars, and countless other disasters we don't even have names for. At any point, if any one of your thousands of ancestors had died before reproducing, you wouldn't exist. If one couple hadn't met, if one child hadn't survived to adulthood, if one person had made a different choice about where to migrate or who to marry, the chain would have broken and you wouldn't be here. But they did survive, every single one of them. Through disasters and catastrophes that would seem impossible to endure, through hardships we can barely imagine, they kept going. They had children who had children who had children, an unbroken chain of life stretching back 900,000 years to those desperate survivors of the volcanic winter. You are the end result of the most unlikely survival story in the history of our species. You are here because your ancestors were tougher, smarter, and more cooperative than anyone had any right to be. You carry their legacy in every cell of your body. So when you face challenges in your own life, when things seem impossible, remember where you came from. Remember that you descend from people who looked extinction in the face and refused to quit. Remember that survival runs in your family, and your family survived the worst that nature could throw at them. The Ice Age ended 11,700 years ago, but its lessons remain. We are resilient, we are vulnerable, we are stronger together than alone, and we are still here, still surviving, still adapting to whatever challenges the world presents. That's the lesson from the frozen past. That's what the Ice Age teaches us. That's why this story matters, because you're not just listening to ancient history, you're hearing your own origin story, the story of how you came to exist against impossible odds, the story of humanity's greatest triumph over adversity. And the story isn't over yet, so here we are, the end of our journey through the deepest winter humanity ever faced. We started in a warm world 100,000 years ago, where early humans lived relatively comfortable lives. The climate was mild, resources were abundant. Our ancestors probably thought the good times would last forever. They always do, don't they? Until they don't. Then came Toba, the supervolcano that changed everything. In a single catastrophic eruption, it threw enough ash into the atmosphere to block out the sun for years. Temperatures plummeted, ecosystems collapsed, and humanity, which had been thriving across Africa and beyond, suddenly found itself fighting for survival against odds that seemed impossible. The genetic evidence doesn't lie. At some point during or after that volcanic winter, human population crashed to maybe 1,280 individuals. That's not 1,280 in one tribe or one region. That's 1,280 people total. The entire human species reduced to a number that could fit inside a modern high school gymnasium. For 117,000 years, they clung to existence. Small groups scattered across whatever refuges they could find, living through droughts that lasted generations, watching the ice sheets advance year after year, swallowing territories that had supported their ancestors, facing diseases, predators, and the constant grinding pressure of a world that seemed determined to erase them entirely. Some groups went extinct. Entire lineages that had survived for hundreds of thousands of years simply disappeared, their genetic legacy lost forever. But somewhere, somehow, enough groups survived. The metapopulation network held. When one community failed, another persevered. When disaster struck one valley, people in another valley kept going. And slowly, generation by generation, they adapted. They got smarter, more cooperative, better at solving problems and sharing knowledge. The bottleneck wasn't just killing them, it was forging them into something new, something tougher and more resilient than anything that had come before. Then around 13,000 years ago, the climate finally broke in their favour. The rains returned, the grasslands recovered, and those bottleneck survivors exploded across the landscape, carrying with them all the survival skills and genetic adaptations that had kept them alive when death seemed certain. Within a few thousand years, they'd split into three groups: modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. All three carried the genetic signature of the bottleneck, but each adapted to different environments, developed different strategies, created different cultures. For hundreds of thousands of years, they thrived alongside each other, sometimes competing, sometimes cooperating, occasionally interbreeding. Eventually modern humans would become the last human species standing. But that's a story for another time. Tonight we're focused on something more fundamental. The simple, miraculous fact that any of us are here at all. Think about it. Really think about it. Every single person alive today, all 8 billion of us, we're all descendants of those 1,280 survivors. Every human achievement, every work of art, every scientific discovery, every moment of love and connection throughout history, it all traces back to a few thousand people who refused to give up when the world turned against them. You carry their genes. Their chromosomal fusion is your chromosomal fusion. Their reduced genetic diversity is your reduced genetic diversity. And most importantly, their resilience, their adaptability, their capacity to endure unimaginable hardship and still find reasons to keep going, that's in you too. When everything in your life feels overwhelming, when the challenges seem insurmountable, remember this. Your ancestors survived 117,000 years of near extinction. They lived through volcanic winters and ice age glaciation. They raised children in conditions that would break most modern people. They maintained hope and cooperation and human connection when every rational calculation said they should just give up. And they made it. Against odds that no species should have beaten, they made it. Which means you can make it too. Whatever you're facing, it's probably not as hard as surviving the last great ice age winter. You've got this. It's literally in your DNA. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let that knowledge settle into your bones. You're not just some random collection of atoms that happen to achieve consciousness. You're part of an unbroken chain stretching back nearly 1 million years. Every one of your ancestors, from those bottleneck survivors to your own parents, faced their own struggles and found ways to persevere. And now you're here, carrying their story forward into an uncertain future. That's not nothing. That's miraculous. If this journey through deep time resonated with you, if learning about humanity's closest brush with extinction sparked something in your imagination, I'd love if you'd hit that like button and consider subscribing. There are so many more stories to explore, so many more moments when history balanced on a knife's edge. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight and what part of this story stayed with you. Was it the scale of the catastrophe, the resilience of the survivors, the improbable chain of events that led to your existence? I read every comment and love hearing how these stories land with different people. And if you want to support the creation of more content like this, YouTube memberships are available, but that's entirely optional. Whether you're a member or just passing through, I'm grateful you chose to spend your evening exploring humanity's frozen past with me. Sleep well, children of survivors. You've earned your rest.